Bonjour à toutes et tous. On va commencer dans une petite minute, le temps que tout le monde se connecte. Hello everyone. Start in a few seconds. Hi everyone, feel free to tell us who you are in the chat section before we start this webinar. Great. It's 12:01. We can start this webinar today on decarbonizing Scope 2, how to measure and reduce your electricity emissions. We're very happy to have Julien and Cyrus, who will present themselves in a few seconds for this webinar on electricity emissions. This is our first webinar in English at SAMI, so it will be the first of many, as we also have more and more international clients. Yes, so maybe to straight go to the agenda of the day. Brief introduction on why are we talking today about electricity emissions, what are the current challenges, how to measure, so really go into the debate of accounting, Scope 2 accounting and electricity carbon accounting with the help of our guests today, and how to reduce both on demand and supply sides electricity emissions. And to do that today, we will have two great guests that we're very happy to have on the next slide. And so I will let first Julien introduce himself.
Hi everyone, thank you Tanguy for the introduction. So I'm Julien, I have an engineering background. I've been at Electricity Maps for more than 3 years now. And at Electricity Maps, we provide granular data, which is used for Scope 2 accounting by some big tech companies. So happy to share more about our knowledge and what we've learned partnering with them.
Hello, I am Cyrus Farhangi. I'm Chief of Staff at Corsica Sol. We are an independent solar power producer, and we're also among the leaders in energy battery storage, which enables to push the limits of solar and wind energy due to their variability. And it's a technology that develops quite fast.
Amazing. We're very happy to have you, Julien and Cyrus. Just also for the quick context, Electricity Maps is obviously very known for all its electricity emissions data sets and is a supplier of SAMI. We use and love Electricity Maps data sets, and Corsica Sol is a known renewable energy provider and also actually a client of SAMI. So very happy to have you both on board. And a quickly word about myself. So Tanguy, I'm one of the founders at SAMI and general manager. And here's a few words about SAMI, who we are, what we do. We are a software provider helping companies manage their emissions, so compute their GHG inventory and track their net zero plan. We are also a consultancy with 15 consultants helping our clients through these steps. We're about 50 people. There's about 5,000 GHG inventories which have been done through our platform. So that gives a bit of an idea of the scale we have. And currently around 30 million tons of CO2 managed across our active customers. And so, yes, this was also to give a little intro about myself. Just also some just information about the webinar. It's being recorded, so you will have access to the replay, and feel free to ask any questions and add comments in the comment section. There will be, as you can see, shown here in the bottom right corner, and we'll be happy to take some questions at the end. We should have, depending on how this goes, about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So hopefully we'll also have time to answer questions. What is Scope 2? Let's start with some definition and see also what we're going to talk about and what we're not going to talk about today. So Scope 2 is basically indirect greenhouse gas emissions that is associated with the purchase of electricity, steam, heat, and cooling. Today, we will focus on electricity emissions for Scope 2, but also beyond. So we leave aside steam, heat, and cooling for today. But feel free to add questions if you have on these. And so these are emissions for Scope 2 that occur at the facility where the energy is generated. So at the power plant, regardless of the electricity source, and accounted for by the organization, by the company that consumes this electricity. So they're a result of the organization's energy and electricity in that case, because we're going to focus on electricity use, but they are generated outside its own operations. And it falls under the Scope 2 category under the different standards that exist. And on the next slide, just why are we talking about electricity emissions today? First, because they're everywhere, and so they are the heart of decarbonization. It's true that when you look at the GHG inventory, you see Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. Scope 2 is never a huge chunk of the inventory, unless you're in a very electricity intensive industry like glass or steel or data centers. But that does not tell the full story of electricity emissions, because apart from Scope 2, you will also find electricity emissions everywhere in your Scope 3. Because in your Scope 3, from your suppliers mostly, in their emission, in the emission factor that you will use for a certain product or a certain service that you purchase, they will also embed some emissions related to their electricity use. So electricity emissions are everywhere, and it's important to remind ourselves that reducing the carbon intensity of electricity will obviously help us as companies to reduce Scope 2, but at the end of the day, it will also reduce every emission in Scope 3. And also, given the fact that electrification is very strong driver of decarbonization, what will happen is that actually when we look at worldwide corporate carbon reporting, there will be a shift from Scope 1 emissions, so direct combustion of fossil fuels, to Scope 2 emissions. So Scope 2 will become more and more of an important topic, and so counting it right and reducing it right, it will be more and more important. Just as a reminder, in France alone, in the different scenarios, for example, given by RTE, electricity consumption is expected to go up from 30 to 40% through electrification of transport, of manufacturing, etc. So yes, big challenge, and that's why we're talking about this today. Now going a bit more into detail into how do we measure electricity emissions and particularly scope 2. First, it's important to have in mind that, again, scope 2 covers emissions related to the purchase of electricity and cover the emissions that are generated during the production of the electricity that is consumed. So it will be in scope 2, but there will actually be part of the emissions related to this electricity being generated in the process of producing them. When you take into account the whole life cycle of electricity production, that would fall in scope 3. So under the French methodology bilan carbone, this would be in the upstream energy category. And under the GHG protocol methodology, this is the 3.3 category, which is fuel and energy related activities. So, for example, if we take, and Cyrus will give us more details about this, but the manufacturing of solar panels, this is where it would fall and not in scope 2. Now, as I mentioned, scope 3 also will embed by nature electricity emissions in other categories. Now, these are rules, and Julien will go more in detail on this, but how does it work? When we just talk about scope 2, we have different carbon accounting standards on the market. The most well-known is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and at the international level, but at the French level, I know there are many French companies in this webinar. Obviously, the bilan carbone French methodology is very prominent. And so the accounting rules differ depending on the standard. If you take GHG protocol and ISO, both market-based and location-based methods are allowed. Now, what is the definition of these two methods? Well, for the market-based, what you will count for the emissions related to the purchase of electricity is the specific energy provider, depending on the type of energy contract. So an energy contract could be just a regular market mix contract, or a green contract with guarantees of origin, or RECs in the US. It could be a PPA. We'll get to that in a few slides. And basically, instead of like the location-based approach, taking the emission factor of the average electricity mix of the given country or region where the consumption occurs, you will take the emission factor from that specific contract with the energy provider. And so location-based, as I just mentioned, is you just take the average electricity mix, for example, of France, I think around 52, 53 grams of CO2 per kilowatts hour in 2025. And you will use that emission factor to calculate the emissions related to your electricity consumption. Now, under bilan carbone and the regulatory BGS, only the location-based rule of calculation is allowed.
Just to go complement a bit on this. So as Tanguy pointed out, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance is a leading guidance on the scope 2 emissions internationally, and also often used as referred to by other guidance. And so in this guidance, dual reporting, what we call dual reporting, is required, which means companies must report at the same time market-based and location-based emissions. And as Tanguy just described, market-based emissions will basically take into account any contractual instruments, which can be certificates or PPAs, while the location-based method will take into account really what country does consumption happen. These rules are about 20 years old, and so today they are quite outdated because inside each of these methods there are some requirements about what is allowed and what is not allowed, and specifications about how these accountings must be performed. So we'll talk a bit more afterward about what's important when choosing emissions factors for this reporting, and also about the current revision of these rules, which is happening with consultation, which just closed, if I'm not mistaken.
Just a few also numbers on the carbon intensity of electricity depending on how it's being generated. So yes, this and Cyrus will also go more into detail when it comes to solar. But obviously, we have here on the first 5 bars fossil fuel generation of electricity, and then on the right renewable energy or biomass and nuclear at the very right. So yeah, this was just to get a little recap as well in terms of electricity, carbon intensity of electricity depending on the source of generation. And one last thing as well about accounting. We mentioned PPAs, so just a recap for those who are not familiar with PPAs, so power purchase agreements. They're bilateral contracts, so between a corporate buyer, a company, or a public entity, and a renewable energy developer to basically secure the energy price over a long time period of time, and to supply electricity to the company. It could be a financial PPA where there is no physical actual supply to the company of the electricity. The project can be far away. But it can also be a physical PPA where there's actually a direct supply. Now, how do we account for this? Well, under the GHG protocol Scope 2 guidance, if you have a PPA, you can account for it, as we mentioned. So you can take the emission factor from that project, from the project developer for the specific project. So generate a specific emission factor rather than using the average grid emission factor. This is valid if the PPA is meeting a certain number of criteria. So under the Scope 2 quality criteria from the GHG protocol. So, for example, the fact that the RECs from the project, so the energy certificate from the project, are not also sold somewhere, so that there is no double counting of these emissions. One last thing as well is that PPAs are usually accessible to very large corporate buyers. So for mid-sized companies, it's not always very easy to get access to this type of contractual instrument. This is changing. We have now seen in the market in France, for example, joint collective PPAs where 10, there was an example in Nouvelle-Aquitaine where 9 companies, mid-sized companies, joined forces to purchase, to contractualize a PPA with renewable energy developer. So also getting more access for all companies and not just the big one.
And so now moving on a bit more on the topic of what emissions factors to use when performing this Scope 2 accounting. So especially as part of the location-based accounting, where companies need to use emissions factors for the place where consumption occurs. There are basically 3 very important considerations when sourcing these emissions factors. Maybe if you click, that is a GIF will start playing, I hope. No. Okay, too bad. But if we go back to time granularity, basically what's time granularity is very important, maybe a bit less in a country like France, where we have a very clean base load, and where electricity emissions will basically remain low throughout the day. But now that we are adding more and more renewables in other grids worldwide, the time of the day and the hour when you are consuming electricity really matters to know what the emissions impact of your consumption down the line. And if we take the example of a grid like California, for example, consuming electricity in the middle of the day will clearly not have the same impact as consuming it in the middle of the night. This one was supposed to show the evolution of Netherlands carbon intensity as we change granularity from a yearly granularity to a monthly to a daily and to hourly granularity. And basically, each time you add some more granularity, you start seeing some differences in the emissions factors, where you also have some seasonal effects. For example, in Netherlands, where there is a lot of solar generation as well, the emissions factors will be much lower in summer than they will be in winter. A second very important aspect to consider is electricity flows. So all grids are highly interconnected. So when using emissions factors, it's very important to use some that take into account these flows. The electricity actually available in a country is a mix of the electricity generated in that country or in that grid and the electricity imported and exported with the neighboring grids. So taking here an example on the right with Estonia in 2024, the first bar you can see is a production-only emissions factor of Estonia. Estonia relies a lot on coal for electricity generation. So their carbon intensity in 2024 was around 500 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hours, if you only consider the generation mix. Now, if you look at the import, which is the second bar, it's about 5 times lower, so around 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hours, because Estonia relies a lot on imports from Finland, and then Finland has quite decarbonized electricity mix thanks to a lot of nuclear, and also even more recently with the addition of the Olkiluoto nuclear reactor. So in the end, the last bar, what you can see is what we call the flow traced emission factor. And so if you can move to the previous slide, the last one is a flow trace emission factor, which take into account the flows between grids. And this one is about 300 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hours. So it really shows the importance of taking into account flows when using these factors. Sometimes it decreases the emission factor, as we see here in the example of Estonia, and sometimes it will increase it. So I have in mind, for example, the example of Austria, which is relying a lot on imports from Germany and Czech Republic, where electricity is quite carbon intensive. And the last one is spatial granularity. So again, I had a nice skip, but this one won't show up here. But basically, on countries like Canada or the US, it's really important to be more granular into each specific grid and each specific regions, because from one region to another, we can see very different emissions factors. If we take the example of the US, for example, we'll have California with a lot of solar, making a lot of progress on the decarbonization of the grid. And then on another grid, like PJM in Virginia, mid-Atlantic US, the grid is still relying a lot on fossil fuels, mainly gas generation, even more now with the addition of more data centers, and so more natural gas generators coming online. And so these grids inside the same country can have a difference of 4 times, 5 times in terms of emissions factors, hence the importance of high spatial granularity. And all that are some parameters which are taken into account in today's revision of the Scope 2 accounting rules. So basically, this is a revision which is undergoing. Here on the slide are the main points of the revisions, which were presented to a public consultation, which was open since November and closed 5 days ago. I won't go into details into all of them, but maybe speaking about some key aspects in the location-based revisions, you can see on the second point that it's written that the requirement now is to use the most precise location-based emission factor accessible. And that's super important because until now, we could use only country yearly averages. So which means that it was not taking into account what we just spoke about the spatial granularity and about the time granularity. So even though highly granular emissions factors were available, companies were not required to use them. And it was also not required to use consumption-based emission factors, taking into account the electricity flows. So all these rules now are becoming part, hopefully, of the revision, with now a location-based method which will require companies to use the most granular available emissions factors. And that's also something we can see in the market-based method, where some similar requirements are put in place. So for the use of certificates and contractual instruments, now it will be required that the moment of generation of these certificates will match the moment at which consumption happened. And also this matching will happen in space with deliverability requirements, which means that a company consuming electricity in Germany could no longer use a certificate of a geothermal power plant in Iceland, for example, which is currently the case, which is currently allowed. Another criteria will hopefully appear in this market-based method, which is the additionality criteria, and which is basically to make sure that when you claim low electricity from a contractual, low emissions electricity from the contractual instrument, you really contributed to the addition of this electricity to the grid, to avoid just claiming electricity from aging hydropower plants, for example, which have been here for forever, and where you did not contribute to decarbonizing the grid.
And I'll just add, something on the using the most precise location-based emission factor. As Julien mentioned, this is really something that is key to if you're using a location-based method, which a lot of companies are doing, also in France under the bilan carbone methodology. It's also important to use something, an emission factor that will be the most recent. So making sure that your electricity emission factor doesn't date back from to 2019 or 2020, or obviously in countries like France, where the electricity mix and the carbon intensity of the electricity mix doesn't vary a lot, the stakes are not that high. But in other countries where electricity grids are decarbonizing at fast pace, it is very important to have up-to-date emission factors. Great, and now on reducing. Now that we've covered how to account for electricity emissions, how can we reduce them? So both on the demand side, this is this slide, but also, of course, on the supply side, which Cyrus will cover at length. There are a variety of things, and this is obviously some quite known and obvious things to do when it comes to acting on electricity demand, but it's still good to remind them and make sure we use all the tools at our disposal to act on electricity emissions. Usually, there's always a first step of understanding your electricity carbon footprint. So it is good to go a bit deeper than just an amount of kilowatts hours, but understand exactly where this comes from, whether it's in your different office spaces, so more for a tertiary use of electricity, or of course, if you have factories and are a manufacturing company, go more into details into exactly where the electricity consumption comes from. So this is done through energy audits. This is also done by implementing building management systems and software and tools for the tracking of electricity consumptions. Now, a second way to act on demand is building renovation and insulation. So obviously, this is also a very known way to reduce the energy, the electricity use when you have electric based heating, and this is also an obvious one. The third one is equipment optimization. So if you were talking about electricity use in offices, just installing low consumption equipments, whether it's replacing heating systems or lighting or IT equipments, or just kitchen space for offices as well, and everything we can think of that consumes electricity. And then if you do have plants and factories, then obviously it requires to go more into details into how to eco-design the production line to reduce electricity consumption per product at the different steps of production. And when we talk about acting on reducing demand, usually awareness and employee training is very important, because these are things that will need to be implemented on the ground. And so employee training is key, implementing eco-friendly habits, which usually require zero to like very little cost, are quite quick win actions that people can take to also act on demand. For the supply side, I'm happy to give the mic to Cyrus with Corsica Sol.
Thank you, Tanguy. So some topics that I will cover include an overview of the expansion of solar energy and storage across the world, what this means for Scope 2 emissions, and a conclusion on the opportunity of PPAs. A few words on Corsica Sol. So we're an independent solar power producer and battery storage operator. We operate in Corsica and other French islands and isolated systems such as Guyana, Martinique, Guadeloupe, La Réunion. We also operate in Eastern Europe, mostly in storage. We recently talked about Estonia. So very recently, we commissioned a large battery storage facility, which will help Estonia decarbonize its mix, but also stabilize its grid in a context where the Baltic countries recently desynchronized from the Russian grid and synchronized with the European grid. So our battery contributes to the stabilization of this move. We can go next. So these figures might not speak to you. So we operate 150 megawatt of solar power plants. We're a small producer among dozens of other French and European producers. 150 megawatt is, let's say, the equivalent of tens of thousands of households' electricity consumption. We aim to reach soon 1.5 gigawatt of solar power and 1.5 gigawatt of battery storage. To give an idea, 1.5 gigawatt of battery storage would be enough if, in case, the Flamanville nuclear power plant in France, and it's the biggest power plant in Europe, nuclear or other technologies. If this plant were to shut down for any reason, the batteries can stabilize the grid if we have 1.5 gigawatts. So that's the equivalent. So batteries provide two services: stabilize the grid in terms of in case of destabilization, and also a use that the general public imagines. So storing electricity, let's say in the daytime where there's too much solar, and release it at night when there's no solar. We can go next. So there's achievements and potential for solar power, which I can present. These are figures of how much electricity was added to global production in the first 3 quarters of 2025. The graphic for 2024 pretty much had the same shape. 2025 is even more pronounced, and 2026 will probably be even more pronounced than the trends we see here, which is that solar power is the fastest growing means of power production. So it's a technology that has limits. Well, the sun doesn't shine at night. Also, especially in northern countries, solar doesn't provide much electricity during the winter. So it's an imperfect technology. Batteries can enable to solve some of these issues, and it's a partial solution to the problem, not a perfect one. Wind is next, and it's being slowed down a bit by policy measures and also by the rise of interest rates, because it's a very capital-intensive industry. But it could pick up again. Nuclear is pretty much going to remain on this trend worldwide. We know what nuclear power plants are in the pipeline for the 10 coming years, so there will be no surprise. And starting in the 2040s, the problem is that the old nuclear power plants, especially in the US and France, will be closing. So we have to build new ones across the world to compensate. But nuclear is part of the solution as well. And to finish on hydroelectricity, what you can see is that low carbon means of production are now almost meeting demand growth. So fossil fuels have not grown much in 2025, and hopefully they will start decreasing very fast in the coming years. The problem with hydroelectricity is that most rivers in the world are already exploited at their maximum. So years when there isn't much rain and there's droughts, hydraulic produces little, and years when there is a lot of rain, it picks up again. But overall, the long-term trend is that hydroelectricity is not going to grow much, unfortunately. And there's even increasing tensions on water due to hydraulic dams. Examples include tensions between Ethiopia and Egypt on the Nile, or Turkey and Iraq on the Euphrates. So there's already tensions, and the potential remaining is not much for geographic reasons. We can go next. Yeah. This is trends on batteries, which is a much more recent technology. The costs have decreased a lot recently, and they're going to continue to decrease a little bit. And as you can see, the result on the right is that battery storage capacity additions are growing exponentially, especially over the last 2 years. So this will enable to push some of the limits, not all, of wind and solar energy that are intermittent. Intermittency is not their only limits. Another limit is that you need a lot of modernization and renovation of the electricity grid. And the world, including Europe, is late in modernizing the grid and investing in the grid of tomorrow. And if we don't do that, then the expansion of wind and solar energy will be slowed because they cannot, there is no grid to connect it to. Yeah, we can go next. One story which is nice to know is that solar power also presents the potential to give access to electricity to billions of humans who currently have little or no access to electricity. One spectacular example is Pakistan, where people freely go to the store nearby and buy solar panels and connect them to their house or to their small business. There's also farmers that do that. So it can be consumers that are either totally off-grid in distant places, in distant villages, or consumers who are connected to the grid, but which ignore the grid, which is expensive and unreliable, and they consume solar power during daytime instead of consuming electricity from the grid. So it's a self-consumption. And Pakistan today is the third market in the world for solar power, and it's entirely grassroots. There is no public policy which is pushing for this. We can go next. So this brings me to electrification. China is the country where industry, transport, especially road transport, including trucks, and where buildings are electrifying the fastest, whereas in the US and the EU, it's flattening. Hopefully it will pick up because obviously one way to decarbonize is to electrify. And because of the trends that I've shown earlier, obviously, the more we electrify, the more solar energy is destined to play an important role in meeting the increase in demand. So the good news, as we saw earlier in another graphic, is that solar power's footprint, carbon footprint, is much lower than gas and much, much lower than coal. Ideally, it should move closer to zero. As we saw earlier, it is a bit more emissive than wind and nuclear. But we also saw that wind and nuclear did not grow as fast. So ideally, we should further reduce solar power's footprint, which brings me to the next point. Yeah, and which brings me to the next slide. This is an extract of the work we've done with SAMI to measure our carbon footprint. and to see where we can act. So obviously there's more details than here, which is already quite detailed, but we have conducted the exercise for every power plant, a solar power plant, for every battery that we use, so we can use the results to see how we can improve our performance. Also, we are developing tools to be able to do this exercise for projects under development, because also the French authorities are asking us for this kind of measurement. So it's no surprise that on the left-hand side, we can see that the equipment that we buy covers most of our carbon footprint. So it's in our power plants. So that's solar power modules, batteries, the structures, so it's the equipment. So if we want to reduce, as well as our competitors, if we want to reduce our footprint, we have to look at our supply chain, which brings me next. Yeah. It should be no surprise that given China's dominance in both solar module production and batteries, we have to look towards our Chinese suppliers to be able to work with them and improve our carbon performance. That includes conducting life cycle assessments, includes also assessing our suppliers according to sustainability criteria. We have a few points on ESG when we analyze the offers in the tenders. So there will be two trends which can go towards progress. First, well, hopefully China's emissions seem to be stabilizing, and hopefully they will decrease. So automatically, Chinese industries' carbon emissions will decrease, and including our suppliers. Also, some suppliers, I won't name any, some suppliers seem to be engaging more efforts than others in decarbonizing their own supply chain. We can already see that some suppliers are already using solar power plants to provide the electricity that they need for their own operations of producing solar modules, whereas some other suppliers still use electricity from the grid, so still mostly coal today. Yeah, we can go next. Oh, I'm a little in advance. So, power purchasing agreements. So the principle was presented earlier on. Indeed, it looks like a hassle-free alternative for companies, for factories, and for electricity contractors to buy low-carbon electricity from producers like us and sell it to consumers in industry or in the service or in public services. So it works typically without subsidies. It's just the market doing its magic. And at Corsica Sol, it's typically what we would like to favor. And we also try to sensitize French authorities that this is an opportunity to be totally independent from the state and to propose industry, especially electricity-intensive industries like steelmaking or chemicals, to propose them with attractive electricity prices. So recent history is that PPAs had become very attractive during the 2022 and 23 European energy crisis. It was due to the Russian gas crisis and also due to the fact that half of French nuclear power plants were stopped for maintenance and renovation. So back then, power prices had gone up very high, and companies were urgently looking for things like PPAs, which provides them with security and visibility. And back then, I remember Corsica Sol was able to propose, let's say, steel-making companies with PPA contracts of 50 euros or 55 euros exactly per megawatt hour, which is a very attractive price regardless of the period. But especially back then, it was very attractive for them. So since then, the PPA market has slowed down quite a bit. European spot prices have come down. That's because gas prices have decreased. The gas crisis has more or less ended. And also the nuclear power crisis has ended. And also we have a problem of solar power oversupply, especially, during daytime. You may have heard of negative prices. As a result, so PPA volumes and prices have decreased. And the prices have come down to a level where for a lot of producers, it's no longer necessarily profitable to produce. I mean, if prices are at 45 euros per megawatt hours, that means that for a lot of solar or wind power plants, it's not profitable to sign a PPA. So right now, 2025 has seen this market slow down. We hope it will pick up again. There's perspectives opened by the advent of battery storage, and the market is increasingly looking into opportunities of combining solar and battery, which is becoming increasingly cost competitive. And solar and battery combined are also able to propose to the clients a different production profile, not just production during the daytime with a peak at noon, but a more stable production that's spread out throughout the day, perhaps even in the first hours of evening.
And to follow up on that, so Cyrus presented how a production side can help the decarbonization of the grid, and that's no doubt it has a big contribution and the main contribution. But there is also, as we are bringing more electrification, a topic we touched upon at the beginning, we are also adding more and more flexible electricity consumption to the grid. And so there is also a potential on the demand side to help decarbonization of the grid by leveraging this flexible electricity consumption to help the grid decarbonization. So this could be electric vehicles, heat pumps, or also small batteries at home that can be leveraged to consume at different times, leveraging the flexibility in order to contribute to grid decarbonization. Leveraging forecast of what are going to be the grid emissions over the next hours in zone, or also comparing different zones when we have flexibility in space. So if we move to the next slide. And so emissions factors, we talked about them already, but mostly in a historical fashion. So looking at how historical emissions factors can be used for improving the accounting. So considering using more granular, using more recent and more accurate emissions factors. But once this has been leveraged, there is also potential to use these emissions factors in real time to monitor how the emissions of electricity consumption behave at the moment, and eventually start identifying a potential of optimization by reducing consumption or increasing it if emissions are low, which can be further leveraged with forecast over the next days to know when to schedule the charge of an electric vehicle if we're an individual, or a fleet of electric vehicles if we are a company which is managing a fleet of vehicles. And so this is also a big potential to reduce Scope 2 emissions and to leverage this demand flexibility. That's something which is already happening now and which we expect will be happening more and more in the future. We see it, I would say, at two levels. The first example is for Google leveraging electricity maps forecast to shift flexible loads of the data centers to time where renewable electricity production is highest. So to reduce emissions by leveraging flexibility at the industrial level. And then the same happened at the individual level. I was taking the example of electric vehicles before. And that's something that charge point management systems start offering also to their users. So when the electric vehicle is plugged for a duration, let's say overnight, or maybe multiple days during the weekend, to charge a vehicle according to the user preferences, which could be about lowering electricity costs, but also lowering electricity emissions, and therefore contributing to decarbonizing the grid with demand flexibility.
Great. Thank you so much, Julien and Cyrus. Lots of insights as to how to reduce the carbon footprint of electricity. I particularly like the example of Pakistan, which also shows that things can go very fast at the macro level. And so it's great to see. There's a few questions. Maybe a first question and feel free to again pop a question in the chat section. It's the first question from Marie-Hélène, which, let me try this. Yes, it works. This is a new webinar tool. Question about, I guess, materials and the battery supply chain. Do we have enough materials to produce and manufacture batteries in the coming years? If I understand your question correctly, Marie-Hélène. Yeah, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I tried to write an answer, but I don't know if it appears, but I drafted a response, but it's better if I answer orally. So yes, obviously it's a very good question and a serious matter. So 90% of batteries would be used for transport, cars, trucks, buses, etc. And 10% should be used for stationary storage, like the work that we're trying to do with Corsica Sol. There were fears of tension on lithium once, but for reasons that I have not followed well, prices of lithium have gone down. There doesn't seem to be that much tension. It could arise one day, but also there's the development of sodium batteries, which could relax the tension. It's the same with cobalt and nickel, which there were fears of tension again, but a technology like LFP batteries, so lithium, iron, and phosphate, would also relax this tension. What is to be feared most is tension on copper, which is much harder to replace. It's not only used in batteries, but also in cables for the grid. There's also many other applications of copper that are growing. You could have aluminum cables, but aluminum batteries, I'm less sure, though I'm not an expert. What I retain from my readings on research and in the literature is that copper could be a source of tension starting in the 2030s and perhaps even earlier. So this would obviously slow the transition and the renovation of electric grids. It's a key material that would be under tension. In any case, I mean, that's my conclusion. It should be no surprise that infinite exponential growth in a finite world, sooner or later, and like more sooner, it is impossible. So whether the first thing that misses is copper or oil, or you can already see water, billions of people lacking water and who are no longer able to expand. So copper will come on top of that, which goes back to what we were saying earlier on sobriety, which should be taken very seriously across the world.
Great. Thank you for this answer. A question from Charlène about REX. How do you account for it in reports? Do you want to take it, Julien, or I can also give it?
Yeah, I can take it for the more greenhouse gas protocol side, and maybe then you can complement a bit for differences in France. But the answer is also that today is a way to account for it, and the rules to account them are pretty loose, which means that in the market-based accounting, you account for these RECs, so not on the location-based, but on the market-based method. And you can use a REC wherever it was generated, let's say in Europe, for any consumption happening in Europe as well. And you only need to reconcile on a yearly basis. So which means at the end of the year, you make the accounting of how much electricity consumption you had during the year, and then you can offset emissions of this electricity consumption with RECs. So if you bought, I don't know, 1 gigawatt of RECs during the year, and you consume 1 gigawatt hours of electricity, then you can match the two to claim zero emissions. But rules are changing, and the Scope 2 rules of the greenhouse gas protocol are getting updated. To basically, because today these rules make it much easier to decarbonize company inventory compared to how hard it is to decarbonize the grid. Because there is very explained it pretty well. Solar has a very specific production profile, and if we need to couple it with batteries, for example, to be able to provide low carbon electricity for all hours of the day. But according to current rules, a company could consume electricity during night and then use breaks, solar breaks, to match this consumption, which makes the decarbonization of their inventory much easier than it is to decarbonize the grid. So that's why the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is now updating the rules, and there will be now requirements of matching electricity consumption and production of these breaks on time, so consumption happening at the same hour than the break was producing electricity, but also in space, so in the same grid. And there will be also maybe some additionality requirements, which will require to, for example, purchase a PPA instead of just purchasing RECs.
Yes, and I think in short, what's the proposal of revision of Scope 2 from GHG Protocol is just make it harder and more related to the physical reality of the world to magically drive your Scope 2 emissions to zero. And I think this is something that a lot of people, when start with carbon accounting, are also surprised with, is that you just need to change your contract to a green energy contract, and you get these emissions to zero. Under the current revision, current revision, it will be indeed harder. It is not a requirement yet under the GHG protocol to have additionality in the projects from the contract from which you buy. It is recommended under the current, but recommendation. Okay, it's not mandatory. So yeah, it's in the current debate to make it mandatory, which would be probably a good step. And again, if you take other methodologies like the French one, well, this debate is just not a debate because market-based approach is just not in the balance. So which is also debatable. This is also a way to drive renewable energy purchases. So there's good and bad reasons for also having excluded market-based approach. There's no perfect solution. I think Cyrus mentioned it in terms of carbon intensity of solar power, but it's the same in terms of carbon accounting. And maybe one last thing as well. So just for those, so RECs are in Europe, we talk more about guarantee of origin. GO RECs is just usually more used in the US, renewable energy certificates, but we're talking about the same thing here. Great. Feel free to ask any questions. We're still around 40 people connected. There was 250 people of you who subscribed for the webinar, and you will get the recording, of course. No further questions? Okay. Yes, Cyrus, do you see a question we haven't covered?
No, there's a question, it seems, from Charlene about
oh yes,
rooftop projects that who gets the benefits of it in its carbon footprint.
Yeah. Do you want to give a try, Julien, or should I can?
Yeah, I'm not much an expert on this one, so maybe you would probably know better than I do.
Yeah, again, so under bilan carbone, for example, this wouldn't be accounted for at all. Knowing that there are standards being in place to, well, for example, for when you have your own project, or for solar roof projects, for example, then taking into account somewhere else. So not under corporate scope 1, 2, 3 reporting, but you might have heard of the Net Zero Initiative, which recommends to take into account these types of potential emission reduction, in what is called a Pillar B. So basically outside of your scope, emission reductions that will not reduce directly your own electricity consumption carbon footprint, but can reduce those of others. So yes, but in my understanding, but we'll can give you more detail as well. This is not something that would fall that would be accounted for under any methodology. Great. Well, I think we can wrap this up. Thank you so much, Cyrus and Julien, for the extremely valuable insights. And we will send you the slides and the replay of this webinar. And feel free to contact any of us if you have any follow-up questions.
Thank you, Tanguy. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.